Hello chess friends and welcome to the Out of Chess channel and welcome back to our Queen's Gambit Decline series. So in this series we're following this very nice opening from White's and from Black's perspective, and today we're continuing again with our Queen's Gambit Decline series and the so-called Tarrasch Defense. The Tarrasch Defense we have explained so far with some great games and with some great opportunities for White and from Black. First we have this intro video, then we have started with our prog variation of the Tarrasch Defense, and then recently we have started also to analyze the so-called classical variation of this very nice opening. So today we're continuing with the classical variation of the Tarrasch Defense with the different opportunities for White, for Black. In our last video we have started to analyze one particular method that I use in order to beat the Tarrasch Defense, but we're analyzing now the counter method against my method, sort of, in which we'll see how you can really go into different lines and different opportunities if you face this opening preparations from Black's perspective here. So as I said, in order to get a better understanding of this video, please also check out my series from the beginning, so intro, part 1, part 2, part 3 and so on, in order to really understand what's going on the board. So let's check out now this counter method against my method that we have analyzed recently with a brilliant game here played by Alexander Grischuk against Ilia Smirin. Because I think this game here played by Alexander Grischuk with the black pieces you can really use as your cornerstone, because here I think Alexander Grischuk will show us the most important strategical and tactical ideas here from Black's perspective. So let's check out now this line again that's I think very important, and then that you'll face probably many times if you're playing the Tarrasch Defense. So here c4 played by Ilia Smirin. The game started as an English opening but transposed into the Queen's Gambit Decline. After move d4 we have now c5. So again, I'm repeating many things we have already explained in our series so far. Maybe some of these things I will not repeat in this video, so as I said, please watch this series from intro, part 1, part 3, part 2, part 3 and so on. So here after move c5 we have now the Tarrasch Defense move, which is now really an explosion in the center of the board. Now White has to be careful, and that's why many times White plays this method: c takes d5, we have e takes d5, and now in the near future of course we can expect here the move d takes c5, or Black will play c takes d4. But whatever happens, the problem always for Black is that Black is left with an isolated d pawn. So this isolated pawn we have talked about many times. It can be really a long-term weakness, because when you face an isolated pawn like you can do here from Black's perspective, if this game goes into an end game, then Black is probably losing the game, because the isolated pawn is not so good to have in a potential endgame. From middle game's perspective, this isolated pawn can be always attacked maybe twice, 3 times by your opponent, but sometimes the isolated pawn can also become your main strength, and that's actually exactly what happened I think in this particular game. You see how this isolated pawn will make further progress, because we have talked about the main strategies when we have an isolated pawn. So it's under the number 1. The theme for White is of course to create a blockade against an isolated pawn. So Black will probably get challenged with a potential blockade. Black will be challenged maybe with some blockade ideas by the knight, by the bishop. So what White is trying to do is never allow this pawn to make progress. But from Black's perspective, of course, the player that has an isolated pawn wants to advance the pawn. So that's why I think you witness here a good isolated pawn so here by Alexander Grischuk, because this isolated pawn will become a very dangerous motif here for Black. So here after move e takes d5 we have now knight to f3, we have knight to c6, g3. Many times you see this particular line because White doesn't want to play the move e3, and then here with bishop to e2, this light for bishop can be locked many times with the potential c4 move. So that's why here this method is the most popular method to play the move g3, then bishop to g2, and then get use of this long diagonal. So here knight to f6, we have bishop to g2, bishop to e7, and castling. Now comes this suggested line that we have talked about in my previous video. I played this line from White's perspective, here d takes c5, because it's a forcing line which has to I think Black needs to play now bishop to c5. That's simply the best move, but now we're playing this very annoying pin. And the problem is now if you protect your pawn here with the move bishop to e6, whatever you do, the problem is that you lose probably your d5 pawn. So that's why black has to play now the move d4, and at least now, okay, the pawn is advanced, still it's an isolated pawn, but at least it's protected now 3 times by the bishop, by the knight, by the queen, and meanwhile, of course, we can use now this long diagonal for the light square bishop. The rook can be maybe maneuvered here to e8, where it can attack, of course, the e2 weakness. So at least the isolated pawn is not so weak anymore, because on d5 I think the isolated pawn is much weaker, because we have now really great tension here around the square d5. You see the bishop is spinning the knight is controlling the d5 square. So at least by advancing the pawn we can have a comfortable game, at least for a while. So the isolated pawn is not a weakness immediately. So here in the continuation you face now this line. This line I suggested you to play from white's perspective in our previous video. Now black has to react again, queen to f6, and now knight to d5. Here Ilia Smirin played knight to d5. We have queen to d8 main line. Many times you face this line, and here after move knight to e2, we have talked about this ideas. Knight to e2 is more accurate, knight to d2, pardon me, is more accurate than to play knight to e1, because of course we have talked, as I said also in the beginning of the video, the main goal of yours is to create maybe a blockade here around the square d3 by because you want to play against an isolated pawn like this. But so far knight to e1 can of course lead to this d3 square, but it's not so good because you want to use maybe this knight in order to create the blockade, knight to f4 and then knight to d3, because in the near future I think you can expect that your knight on d4 d5 will be challenged by a potential bishop to e6 move. So that's why knight to d2 is a little bit more accurate than to play knight to e1. So here in the continuation we have rook to e8 here by Alexander Grischuk. Very nice move. He's staying now a little bit longer with the bishop on c8. He's waiting and he wants to see what white is doing here, because if you play immediately bishop to e6, then of course knight to f4 happens, and then again the bishop gets challenged. Then you have to lose another tempo. Meanwhile white will simply jump here on d3. So I think here this move rook to e8 is more accurate than immediately to challenge here the knight on d5. So in the continuation we have now rook to c1 here by Ilia Smirin, attacking the bishop on c5, bishop to b6. Very nice move here by Alexander Grischuk. You can also play bishop to f8, but when we watch now this position of the bishop, I think this bishop should not stay on this diagonal, because it's not attacking anything. At least on this diagonal, the bishop on b6 is maybe potentially, not immediately, but in the long runs it can maybe attack the weak pawn on f2. And the problem I think for white is here that you don't want to take out the bishop here immediately, because after queen to b6 I don't think you gained anything, because we can, when we evaluate the strength of the minor pieces, I think the knight on d5 is much better here than the bishop on b6, because the bishop on b6 is blocked out by its own pawn. And in order to make this bishop perfect, you have to advance the pawn on d3. But so far, this d3 pawn, d3 push is not possible. So in order to improve the dark square bishop, you have to maybe even sacrifice the pawn, but you don't gain anything. So as I said, here I'm not sure if white is going to ever trade off this good knight, this centralized knight, for such a bad bishop on b6. So that's why bishop to b6 is a tempting move. If you want to take, you take. We take simply out this powerful knight. You can maybe get the tempo, but now with queen to c5, I don't know, bishop to g4, then followed with rook to d8. White doesn't have anything, I think, in this particular position. I think black will solve now all of the position problems. Black will have really brilliant setup with the move rook to d8. I think when we support the d4 pawn further with our rook behind the pawn, I think it's a brilliant then middle game then for black. So that's why I'm not sure if, as I said, white will ever take here the bishop on b6. So here, as I said, after move bishop to b6, here in the continuation, Ilia Smirin tried knight to c4. a4. Here he tried to further challenge the bishop on b6. Here comes very important move, bishop to g4. As we said, attacking simply the e2 weakness, very important move, which is forcing now here Ilia Smirin to protect the pawn. But the problem is now that the f2 pawn is a little bit weak, and as I said, again, in the long run, after move d3, you see this f2 pawn could be really an object of the attack. Again, if black wants to play the game like this, white needs to make a counter play against this potentially powerful bishop. And again, if white wants to take, if you want to play, I don't know, knight to b6, then after a takes b6, you see you have again problems. The a2 pawn is hanging, but also now the e2 pawn is hanging, so it's now, I think, a much better continuation. You cannot protect really both of these pawns, so that's why you have to play, I think, this move rook to e1. We have now bishop to c5 by Alexander Grischuk, and here Ilia Smirin tried a3 with preparations maybe to push to kick away the bishop here further with the move b4. But now after move a6, Alexander Grischuk is saying, you're not going to catch my bishop anymore in this particular game, because after b4 here, Alexander Grischuk played now bishop to a7. You had your chance to take out the bishop, which was in the beginning a bad bishop, but now it becomes really a strong bishop, because we can really expect in the near future this advanced pawn d3, and then here this long diagonal will get open, and this will be then really the best piece on the board. So here after move knight to f4, we have rook to c8. We have queen to b3, and now very important move here by Alexander Grischuk, challenging simply the knight on the f4. If you try something, I don't know, let's see, a4 to push further, then you get simply this one, bishop to f4, g takes f4, and then the e2 pawn is hanging. Also then the f4 pawn is weak, so it's something I think that white needs to resign. So maybe if you try here something like knight to d3, again rook to e2 or bishop to e2 are moves that are great here for black. So you have to, I think, play the game like this, knight to d5, played by Ilia Smirin. He got out of the attack of the bishop, but now the fun really starts. So here in the continuation, bishop to e2, played by Alexander Grischuk. What Ilia Smirin was hoping for is to trap the rook with the move knight to b6. You see Ilia Smirin played knight to b6, and the problem is now you cannot even advance the rook to c7 because the knight is also protecting that square, so the rook is trapped. But that's exactly what Alexander Grischuk wanted to happen, because now after bishop to e2 and the knight to b6, he has now the brilliant move d3, and the really great stuff how Alexander Grischuk played now the game. As I said, the main weakness of this particular game can be the isolated pawn, but actually the isolated pawn becomes the main strength here of blacks. Really wild stuff. That's the beauty of this isolated pawn positions. Sometimes you lose the isolated pawn, sometimes you sacrifice it, sometimes you advance it, but it's always about this isolated pawn on the d file. So here in the continuation of the move d3, you cannot of course take rook to knight to c8 because you get simply d2. If you take, then we of course here promote a new queen, so you lose the rook. Meanwhile, of course, we can also take out the knight, so it's not a good continuation here for white. Black is simply winning this game. So here after move d3, queen to a2 was played by Ilia Smirin, protecting now the d2 square. In the continuation, we have rook to c7, knight to c7, and after bishop to c7, knight to d5, and bishop to b8. Okay, black has lost now the rook for the bishop, but still has this very annoying pawn on d3. If you try now bishop to f1, that's also maybe a method that white could use in order to defend himself here. It's not so good because you get knight to d4, then knight to f3 is of course weak. Even if you take, then you get the fork on e2, so it's again completely winning game then for black. So not a good move here, the move bishop to f1. So actually white needs to protect this position in a different way here after move bishop to b8. Here Ilia Smirin tried this blockade. As I said, the best way to play against an isolated pawn, now against this advanced pawn, you have to create a blockade. But now after move knight to d4, all of the pieces of blacks are really good. They're dancing in front of white's king. This is now a very annoying setup to handle. In the continuation, we have rook to c3, and now after bishop to a7, as I said, we're using now finally this long diagonal for the Dutch bishop. Now the fun starts, because after move knight to f4, here Ilia Smirin found a brilliant move. Maybe you can pause the video and try to see now a brilliant tactic that Grischuk won. It's not a winning tactic, we have to say it. It's a tactic that gives black a slight advantage in the continuation in the endgame stage, so it's a must move. If you don't play the move, you will probably lose the game, because the knight on f4 is of course challenging now this bishop. So in a couple more moves the bishop can be taken, so you have to be fast here, you have to make an aggressive move. So try to pause the video and find the best continuation, take your time, maybe it's not so easy to see. So okay, the move that Alexander Grischuk found is a brilliant move, knight to b3, deflecting really this rook from the defense, because if you try here rook to b3, then you get this one, bishop to f2, and even if you try, I don't know, king to h1, then bishop to e1, here you have to play the game like this, and now d2, and black is simply promoting to a new queen. Of course, if you take out here the bishop on f2, then you get queen to d4, and it's a checkmate. The only thing that you can do is of course to prolong the game by playing queen to e3, then after queen takes e3, it's a beautiful checkmate. So knight to b3, really wild stuff, brilliant move by Alexander Grischuk, attacking simply the queen. If you move the queen, then the pawn gets advanced and it's simply game over. Also queen to d4 is an opportunity, bishop to f2 we have seen is a brilliant tactic, so it's simply game over if you don't react here. But the only move that helps out here white is the move rook to d3. You have to sacrifice back material. Bishop to d3, we have rook to e8, everything is now pretty much forced. After rook to queen to e8, we have queen to d3, queen to e1, and now after queen to f1 we have bishop to f2 here by Alexander Grischuk. The queen gets deflected, you cannot of course take here because of this annoying attack on the first rank, so you have to step back from the defense of the queen. But now after queen to f1, bishop to f1, we have reached now an endgame position in which of course black is slightly better because black has an extra pawn. But it's not so easy to win this endgame, because these are opposite colored bishops, which means now that most of the times these games are ending in a draw. You have to be careful here. So in the continuation we have king to f8, we have bishop to g2, b6. Here Alexander Grischuk got challenged, but he moved simply his pawns on dark squares, where the pawns cannot be attacked of course by the light square bishop. So here knight to d2, after trades of pawns, here Grischuk is trying to centralize the pieces. It's now very important to play towards the center with all of your pieces, because the pieces are best of course in the center of the board, and you have to be careful. Of course you have to stay with your pawns on dark squares, because you don't want to have your pawns get attacked by the light square bishop. So here h6, we have bishop to a2, we have here g5, bishop to g8, now king to d6. The problem I think here in this particular endgame is that you see the knight is controlling these two squares, so the problem is now the king cannot move towards here the other side of the board, because these two squares are restricted by the knight, and this square is restricted by the bishop. So far Ilia Smirin built a very nice defensive setup. He's not allowing this king to march further, because if the king for instance gets here towards the queen side and attacks this weak pawn, then it's of course game over for white. So that's why here Ilia Smirin played, I think, so far a decent endgame. He is not allowing here the black's king to advance. But now after f4, we have g takes f4, g takes f4. At least what Alexander Grischuk has created here is a pass pawn, because even if you manage to attack somehow maybe this weak pawn on f4, then you're leaving a little bit your a4 pawn a little bit weak. But also the good part is that the knight on d2 is controlling here the f3 square, so the king cannot go here. So far one pass pawn created here by Alexander Grischuk, perfectly fine. So here in the continuation we have h4, we have king to e7, bishop to d5. Now again here we have a perpetual moves here. The black's king cannot again advance. We have now king to f6, we have king to h3, king to f5, we have bishop to c6, we have knight to b1. Here Alexander Grischuk moves a little bit the knight, but he found now a great idea here. After move bishop to b3, he found now this idea, knight to b4. This was, I think, a very important move that Grischuk realized, because after knight to b4 and 8x b4, at least what Grischuk has created here are now 2 pass pawns. And you see now, maybe you can always block out one pawn with, I don't know, bishop to d1, and then you play, I don't know, king to g2, and you're never allowing your opponent to advance the pawn on f3. But when you have created 2 pass pawns, then the position gets a little bit too stretched. The king has to protect one pawn, the bishop has to protect one pawn, so it's now not a pleasant endgame here for white. The problem, I think, here is that we have now a little bit of wrong bishop here, because if this endgame ends like this, let's imagine you don't have any more this pawn, you don't have any more this pawn, and this pawn, and maybe even if white is left with without the light square bishop, if black has now this pawn, the dark square bishop against the king and the king, so this should probably then draw, because this is now the so-called wrong bishop. You cannot advance the pawn. This game will probably end in a draw if you're left, as I said, with the dark square bishop, with the h pawn, and only with the king on the board. So it's not so easy also, as I said, for black to win the game. Let's see now what happened. At least one mission accomplished, because at least here Alexander Grischuk has now two pass pawns on the f file, but also here one on the b file. So here, after move bishop to c2, we have king to e5, king to g4. Now h5 by Grischuk, we have king to f3, bishop to b6, and now after move bishop to g6. This was not a good move, because here after move b3, we have now bishop to bishop takes h5, but it's not a good move, because here after move king to f6 in this position, Ilia Smirin resigned. You see all of these squares are taken, the bishop cannot get back and cannot protect anymore the b1 square. Now this pawn will march, and it's of course a completely winning endgame here for Grischuk. Here in this position, Ilia Smirin resigned. So, but that's not the point. I think the most important thing that we want to study of this particular game is after the move bishop to f6, after queen to f6, now comes probably move knight to d5. We have queen to d8, now knight to e2, and now rook to e8 is a setup that we want to see. Bishop to rook to c1, bishop to b6, in my opinion slightly more accurate than to play the move bishop to f8, because we don't use our bishop like this. The bishop is not doing anything, at least here on the move with the move bishop to b6. At least the bishop stays on this diagonal, and it's a little bit tempting, as I said in the beginning, if your opponent wants to take, allow him to take, because now at least the queen gets out. He gave up this powerful centralized knight on d5. You may get challenged with the move knight to c4, but it's not such a powerful attack, I think, here for white. So this is now the line. We're moving up now to another line of the classical system. It's now very important, I think, to study this opening like this, because these are things that will happen to you probably if you play the game from white's perspective. If you play the game from black's perspective, this is still a complicated opening. You see many things can happen to you, and I think we should really be familiar with all of the possible potential strategies and tactics in the middle game stage. So okay, I hope that you enjoyed the game. I really enjoyed it a lot. A great game played by the top grandmaster Alexander Grischuk. If you want to study the Tarrasch defense more, check out the Tarrasch defense so far with some brilliant games that we have analyzed before. And if you want to see our whole d4 studies of the Queen's Gambit Declined, here's also our Queen's Gambit Declined series playlist. Check it out with some different ideas that we have studied before. We have also analyzed the Chigorin defense, the Harvard's attack, and many more. And if you like this content, don't forget to subscribe to my channel. See you soon with some more videos, and chess is the best, of course.